This series is all about universes, multiverses, planets, worlds, continents and cities. We're delving not into specific games, but into the milieus created for them. We'll be looking at where these settings came from, the major features, and why you should consider them for your own gaming experiences. In 1987, a third official TSR campaign setting was introduced to players of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, after Greyhawk in 1980 and Dragonlance in 1984. This was the Forgotten Realms, a world that readers of Dragon magazine had already become familiar with through the articles of one Ed Greenwood. But its origins go back further than that, and the twists and turns of the history of the setting has taken, since being introduced to the public, have been nothing short of astounding. As the Realms has such large scope, I'm splitting my coverage of it into its component subsettings. That is, while Karatur, Maztica, the Hordelands and Zakara are all connected to the Realms, these will perhaps be mentioned here, but covered in more detail within their own videos. In this particular video, we'll be visiting that portion of the Realms most familiar to those who follow it through gaming and novels, the western portion of Faerûn, from the border of the Hordelands to the Sea of Swords. Well met, and welcome to the Forgotten Realms. In 1967, a young Ed Greenwood imagined the Forgotten Realms as a parallel Earth for escapist stories to which people once travelled to, leading to tales of the fantastic being based on observation. But over time, knowledge of how to travel between these worlds had been lost. Hence, the people of Earth gradually lost memory of this second world, and therefore those that remembered came to know them as the Forgotten Realms. The world was a natural fit for Greenwood's Dungeons & Dragons campaign once he discovered that, and served as the backdrop for copious articles that he wrote for Dragon magazine from 1979 on. He wrote about such diverse subjects as depicting firearms within D&D, creating fantasy calendars, the 9 Hells, and runic magic, alongside new spells, monsters and character classes, and being a major contributor to the Ecology of the series, most notably providing a detailed look at beholders, chimeras, mimics, exegatital and trappers. Snippets of information about his home campaign, in the form of realms lore, were sprinkled through these articles, and he often adopted a writing style placing him in the role of a scholar from the realms, or the Earth recipient of information from such a scholar, including his most famous character creation, Elminster. By the time 1986 arrived, TSR were on the hunt to introduce a new campaign setting for the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game, one they could use as a sort of standard default. It couldn't be Mystara, as that was happily living its life as the default world for the Dungeons & Dragons game, the edition that we now know today as BX and BECMI. It couldn't be Ravenloft, as Gothic Horror wasn't seen as AD&D's core offering. It couldn't be Dragonlance, as that diverged from the core rules of AD&D too much, and besides which was still in the throes of the War of the Lance, with the DL-coded modules still running. DL-14, the final capstone to the war's tale, would arrive later in 1986. With Gary Gygax leaving TSR in 1985, the feeling was that this setting, his setting, Greyhawk, wasn't appropriate under these circumstances. The hunt naturally led to Ed Greenwood and the Forgotten Realms. Surely, a world framework that spawned such diverse and copious material for magazine submissions should have enough bulk behind it to turn it into an official AD&D setting. And so, TSR stalwart Jeff Grubb was tasked with touching base with Ed and exploring the concept of bringing the realms into officialdom. Famously, Grubb asked Greenwood if he made stuff up as he went along, or if he really did have a vast store of information about his Forgotten Realms. Ed simply answered yes on both counts. And so Greenwood and Grubb set to work on bringing the Realms to print as an open-ended high fantasy world that was closely aligned to the AD&D rules. In particular, the embryonic second edition of the game that was starting to be worked on. To illustrate this underlying concept of the Realms being open enough to accommodate virtually any fantasy concept, certain TSR works were redirected to be framed within the Realms. The H series of high-level modules centred around Bloodstone Pass, and a series of Celtic-themed novels Douglas Niles was working on, for example, the latter becoming the Moonshine trilogy, released under the Forgotten Realms banner a month before Greenwood and Grubb's grey box Forgotten Realms campaign setting came out. This set included maps covering the north of the Western Realms, all the way down to Camshan and Chult in the south, and from the Moonshires across to Rashomon and Thay, a huge chunk of land known as Faerûn, encompassing culturally diverse analogues to late medieval and early Renaissance Europe, Celts, Scandinavians, Persians, Egyptians, pirates, Spanish conquistadors, Slavs and more, alongside the traditional D&D elves, dwarves, halflings, orcs and so on. Beyond the set, only a handful of additional resources were released for the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game for the Forgotten Realms prior to its second edition. The Bloodstone series, the H series previously mentioned, that began in 1985 as support for the battle system AD&D related wargame, was retroactively fitted to the realms. The final module of the series, Throne of Bloodstone, released in 1988, being the only one to carry the Forgotten Realms banner. Ruins of Adventure and Curse of the Azure Bonds, released in 1988 and 1989 respectively, connected into the Gold Box SSI computer games Pool of Radiance and Curse of the Azure Bonds, and they were on the border. The two adventures, like the computer games, are loosely connected, but Ruins of Adventure was released under first edition, while Azure Bonds fell on the second edition side of the fence. Treasure Hunt and its Korean archipelago were retroactively fitted to the realms, falling under the N series for Novice, a sequence of low-level unconnected adventures that also included Against the Cult of the Reptile God, The Forest Oracle and Destiny of Kings. Under Ilafan, Module N5 from 1987 was the first adventure module to carry the Forgotten Realms banner on its cover. Certain of the Oriental Adventures modules also carried the Forgotten Realms banner within the era of first edition, but we will cover that particular chunk of the realms in another video. Alongside the core campaign setting were the FR supplements, the first 6 of which, Waterdeep and the North, Moonshine, Empires of the Sands, The Magister, The Savage Frontier, and Dreams of the Red Wizards, were released in that initial 1987 to 1988 period. These took closer looks at various geographical regions of the realms, with a couple of exceptions which looked at non-geographical subjects, such as The Magister, which took a closer look at realms magic. One key concept of the initial phase of the setting was to leave the realm of Sembia more or less untouched, barring sparing details in source and on maps. The goal here was to give individual dungeon masters an area to develop themselves, close to the core regions of Cormyr, the Sea of Fallen Stars, and the Dale Lands. It is within 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, launched in 1989, that the Forgotten Realms really reached its stride. The setting received 2 box core sets in 1993 and 1996, including numerous boxed and book supplements that expanded the realms in all manner of niches, including esoteric shopping sprees and minutiae regarding small and large settlements, the ecology of various fantastical fauna, fitting given Ed Greenwood's famous dragon articles, and a continuation of the FR Closer Look supplements. A trend was starting with the advent of 2nd edition of the Realms mapping against the core rules of Dungeons & Dragons itself. Here, the transition from 1st to 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was marked by the Time of Troubles, represented in a series of novels and adventures, Shadowdale, Tantras and Waterdeep, that provided meta detail explaining why aspects of the realms were originally one way and are now another. Clerics, for example, were especially affected, going from an access to all spells model under 1st edition to an access by deity sphere of influence model in 2nd. This sort of catastrophic event leading into the changes between editions of D&D would similarly occur during the changes between 2nd and 3rd, with a light touch, and again between 3rd and 4th, with a major impact, and between 4th and 5th, pretty much a reset for sanity. Some of the highlights for me within the 2nd edition Forgotten Realms output set within Faerûn include the Raven's Bluff sourcebooks, compiled and developed from the pages of the Role-Playing Gamers Association's, RPGA, Polyhedron magazine, and its Living City articles, For Duty and Deity, an adventure crossover between the realms and their planescape setting that leads into the Ravenloft adventure Castle Spulzir, The Drow of the Underdark, probably the best of the FOR series, Faiths and avatars, alongside its companions, powers and pantheons and demi-human deities, which provide one of the most complete treatments of gods in any setting, let alone a D&D one, and Netheril, Empire of Magic, which dived into Faerûn's history. Many will probably add the ruins of Undermountain to that list, but for me, while I found some of the set and its follow-ups useful and interesting, huge poster maps depicting miles of dungeon corridors never really appealed. I'm not a fan of mega dungeons of that sort of sprawl. During the 2nd edition run, the Forgotten Realms city of Ravensbluff was used as a centre for RPGA organised play, within the concept of the Living City. The broad concept was that, as a player, you could bring your Living City character to any convention that was running a Living City event, take part in the event with that character, level up, gain items, and pack that character away, ready for the next convention. This format ran within the Living City from 1987 to 2003, with the vast bulk of the adventures concerned using the 2nd edition rules. The transition to 3rd edition was largely one of events rather than cataclysm. It is the era of the Baldur's Gate computer games, with that particular game coming out in 1998, just before 3rd edition, and its follow-up, Shadows of Am, arriving in 2000. Under 3rd edition, the day of the box set was pretty much over, within a Dungeons & Dragons context, and so the campaign setting received a hardback core book, coupled with a facelift in logos and design ethics. While not as extensive as the output for 2nd edition, the 3rd edition output, and here I include both 3.0 and 3.5, was focused and built upon the detailed foundations constructed during the heavier release schedule of 2nd edition. Highlights for me here are the campaign setting book itself, which I think should have been kept as a template for D&D campaign setting presentations going forwards. Mysteries of the Moonsea, because, probably due to the way I hammered the SSI Goldbox computer games in my Amiga back when, that region is still amongst my favourite areas of the realms. City of Splendours, which updates the City of Waterdeep for the 3rd edition, and The Grand History of the Realms, which is a great guide, providing glue to stick the various tidbits of Realms history lore found in sourcebooks and computer games together into a consumable framework. The Realms under 3rd edition did lose some of its lustre, however, where, during 2nd edition, it was the default setting more or less, with even side settings such as Karatur and Zakhara of Oriental and Arabian adventures retrospectively tacked onto it. Greyhawk became the definitive default under 3rd edition. From 2000, as Living City play was winding down, Living Greyhawk play was winding up, and that became the default RPGA organised play setting through to 2008. While Greyhawk didn't receive much in the way of specific sourcebooks, it did receive some, but nowhere near as the output dedicated to the Realms and Eberron. But it was still at least mentioned in virtually every core and core expansion volume for the D&D game. The Realms, arguably, did even worse under 4th edition. While it suffered the spell plague and great upheavals, creating all sorts of political and geographical strife that fed into 4th edition's Points of Light structure, the setting received only 3 books, a campaign guide and a player's guide in 2008, plus Elminster's Forgotten Realms, an addition neutral sourcebook that meanders through a set of core points of immersion, rather than a meta-level setting overview. This book looks at some of the elements of the realms that make it tick for its residents. While this latter work is almost time period independent, too, the realms themselves were propelled forwards by nearly a century from the close of 3rd edition to the focus of 4th edition, and that being a post-spell plague landscape still in the throes of upheaval, as the fallout from that major between editions event are faced by new heroes, and certain very long-lived heroes, particularly if they are associated with a series of best-selling novels set within the realms. The Realms underwent a form of reset for 5th edition. With the setting's lore, this was the Second Sundering, which sort of fixed some of the issues arising from the 4th edition Realms reconfiguration, rebooting the place to some semblance of its form and function during its 1st and 2nd edition run. Under 5th edition, the Realms takes the stage as the default setting, with similar references made to it within the core books as Greyhawk enjoyed during 3rd edition, and nearly every official adventure, with notable exceptions, take place within the Realms, and in particular its Sword Coast region. Even with many D&D settings returning in one form or another, Eberron, Spelljammer, Ravenloft and Planescape, for example, this trend looks to continue into the next iteration of D&D. We shall see, but there is no doubt that the Realms remains one of, if not the, most famous D&D setting, especially beyond the D&D game itself, thanks to the success of Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights, the series of computer games, and a continuing stream of novels set within the world. Now, there have been some comments from certain quarters stating that the Realms is not an amalgamation of real-world cultures, but from a setting perspective, I will dispute that. From a narrative perspective, perhaps not, particularly with the original concept put forward by Ed Greenwood regarding the Realms being a world which could be visited from our Earth. But with some very definitive real-world cultural parallels, plus some mirrors to events from history, there are familiar overtones to large parts of it. But this is not a criticism. Dungeons & Dragons grew from a wargame intended to depict medieval warfare and added in fantasy elements drawn from literature and real-world mythology. The game itself has real-world parallels, and so a setting constructed to depict the game's elements by default inherits those parallels. So, much as the D&D game itself is a kitchen sink sort of affair, so the Forgotten Realms follows suit. In this way, it is in reality, and before you even get to those related settings we will cover in future videos such as Kara-Tur and Zakara, a collection of subsettings. Within each, entire campaigns can be wrought. As players within a Forgotten Realms campaign, it is more likely that you are in fact a Sword Coast player, or a Dalelands player, or a Moonsea player, and so on. The existence of these other mini-settings, the ones that you aren't using to full extent within your gaming, is still useful as they provide backgrounds for characters of an exotic nature within the home subsetting of the campaign. A Sword Coast campaign could, for example, host a player character from Rashomon, which can add an element of colour to the play. So just for a whistle-stop tour of the place you might see and the adventures you might have, I'll whirl around the Western Realms' major areas in summary. The far north, where civilization clings to what life can be eked in this Arctic border between glacial wastes and a more civilized land beyond the mountains to the south. Thus boxed in are the towns of Icewind Dale, beset by monsters and barbarians alike. Over those southern mountains sits the north, pocked with fortifications, villages, towns, and the far-flung cities of Luskan, Mirabar, Silverymoon, and the famed Neverwinter. This region fits the Points of Light style of play, with lots of wilderness dotted with a sprinkling of more or less safe areas. Safe unless some corrupt paladin unleashes a plague of some sort, that is. The Sword Coast comes next, a strip of land more civilised than the north, dominated by the trade centres of Waterdeep and Baldur's Gate, two very famous names in the annals of the realms indeed. This region is traditionally used for rescue civilization from disaster-type adventures, as can be seen within the Baldur's Gate series of computer games, and adventures such as Tyranny of Dragons and Descent into Avernus. East of the north stands the desert expanse of Anarok, once the realm of Netheril come to disaster. This is one of the many deserts suitable for desert adventure settings. East of Anarok, and the lands within the influence of the Sword Coast, are the heartlands of Cormyr, traditional medieval fare, Sembia, a land of mercantile city-states, the Dalelands, a collection of rural valleys scattered around the site of an ancient elvish realm, and that brings to mind, for me, the Dales of North Yorkshire, one of my most beloved places on earth. North of the Dalelands is the Moonsea, centre of the Gold Box SSI computer games. Ruins of Adventure, kicking the series off, is set in Flann, and also the heart of one of the primary antagonistic organisations, the dread Zhentil Keep. North of the Moonsea are the barbarian plainslands of Thar and Vasa, the latter connected to the Bloodstone Pass of the H-series of high-level adventures from the 1980s. The focus here is within the interplay between the different realms and cities. The Dragon Reach is another strip of independent cities, including Ravensbluff and Tantris, the former the location of the Living City campaign I outlined within the history. The realms of Impelter and Thay, another of the nefarious bad guys that some of you may know from the recent Dungeons & Dragons movie, Rashomon and Aglarond, two realms steeped in magic. Mystical adventures and the machinations of especially the latter three realms against each other are abound here. The Sea of Fallen Stars is an inland sea south of all of this amalgamation, which is a good setting for coastal pirate campaigns. There's even subtly named Pirate Isles within it. Now for the central strip that separates the north from the south, the nations of Am, Tethir, Termish and the Vilhon Reach area. These regions are centres for trade, and that tension can be built into a more faction-oriented campaign, rather than one represented by the threat of monsters. Within the south, we have the mini-Arabian Nights setting of Kalamshan, a slice of Zakhara away from Zakhara. The Shah provides an open plain inhabited by a variety of nomads, human, centaur and the lion centaur-like Wemmicks, for example. Haurua is an isolated magical nation possessing its own unique style of wizardly adventuring potential and somewhat resembles, to my mind, Alphatia from the Mystara setting. Luren is a halfling realm, so if you're into trying out an all-halfling campaign, that could give you a start. Then we arrive at the Babylonian Unther, Egyptian Mulhorand, and further Middle Eastern-style realms in the shape of Estegund, Var, and Durpar, particularly the latter, where the relocated Desert of Desolation series of modules began their tale. And finally, we come to the jungles of Chult, dinosaur-plagued, and any number of Tarzan-like or Lost World settings and games can be set there. All of those are simply general and vague suggestions and brief notes on the main focal areas. I'm not making any suggestion that my concepts about them are the only ones, but it's what leaps from the page to me when I read about them. The Realms is vast in size and scope, even just considering, as we are in this video, the more familiar western reaches of the setting's main continent. From the Arctic milieu of the north, and Icewind Dale to the dinosaur-plagued sultry jungles of Chult to the south, the strange realms of Rashomon and Thay in the east, and they eventually broke open to the wide plains and steppes beyond, between Faerûn and Kalatur. To the wind-swept and wave-beaten Moonshine Islands in the west, virtually any fantasy scenario concept that you can think of can be played out within its bounds. This has made many older modules, for example the Desert of Desolation series, slot in so easily with the original modules of the trilogy presenting a unique setting of their own, to be compiled into a single book release, transplanting that setting with a bit of map rejigging into the realms. Virtually any adventure, not specifically tied to a setting's core nature, can be hosted by the realms, and even many that are. Against the Cult of the Reptile God can be a village anywhere, and could easily be plonked into the realms, despite its Greyhawk origin. The Temple of Elemental Evil's core has already been brought over into the 5th edition adventure Princes of the Apocalypse, as has the Tomb of Horrors within the Tomb of Annihilation. Classic modules such as Keep on the Borderlands, Slave Pits of the Undercity, Master of the Desert Nomads, Castle Amber and the Isle of Dread, and more are easily brought into the realms, with little or no work, and I believe the entire Dragonlance saga could be adapted to the realms with just a bit more effort. In many ways, this makes it a better Dungeons & Dragons meta setting than Greyhawk, and this is not surprising. Greyhawk was originally designed to present a patchwork of nations that could fight each other in war games. On the other hand, the Realms was designed, and here I mean from the point of it entering the halls of TSR as a design concern, as a catch-all representation of the game's default. The development of published settings has a fairly clear lineage, from Judges Guild proving to TSR that published settings were a viable thing, through TSR's first steps into the field by adapting one of the early house milieus of one of the primary designers, through exploring settings specialised to a particular campaign arc such as Dragonlance, to bringing together something that can be used for anything. Obviously, not exactly anything, as TSR continued to explore more specialised branches of fantasy with, for example, Dark Sun, but certainly from a straight-out-of-the-core rulebooks perspective. So it makes sense that as we explored in the history section, the Realms has changed with the additions of D&D. The rules change, so the setting evolves to encompass those changes, sometimes by cataclysm, sometimes by something subtler. This then brings us to what I feel is the realm's most negative feature, and ties into the plethora of novels published too, the ongoing march of time. When the setting was originally released, Sembia was purposely left alone for Dungeon Masters to play with. Via novels and supplemental information, it wasn't long before this DM's playground was playground no longer, and had canon material plastered all over it. If you were happily playing a Dalelands game, traipsing around Cormanthor, perhaps having the odd foray further abroad into the Moonsea or Cormyr, the time of troubles threw things for a loop. The realms changing with the rules is a reasonable feature to have within a core default setting, but it is a drawback too when coupled with the interlocking meta-narrative presented by novels, computer games, adventures and sourcebooks. The realms doesn't stay still enough for a DM to properly get their teeth into unless canon is ignored, in whole or part. When that is done, one could argue the shared experience concept of a published world goes out of the window. Now, with settings such as Traveller's Charted Space, this isn't so much of an issue, because the setting is vast enough and the canon slim enough to not have either get in the way of each other too much. Glorantha isn't so vast, but the march towards the hero wars aside, the majority of its canon is about describing the people and the places within the setting than presenting a metaplot. Within the realms, you can almost guarantee that some chunk of canon is going to arrive at some point that will leave a Forgotten Realms Dungeon Master with a decision to stay with or split from that canon. Meta-narratives might be good for shifting novels, but they are a pain for playing a world. Anyway, that aside, the Realms is an odd collated mixed bag of details. For some regions, such as the Sword Coast, you'll find information of what kind of wine is favoured by which city, and which merchant company ships that wine about. You'll find minute details in the daily lives of monsters, especially when considering the Elminster's Ecology series. You'll even find portions of it brought to interactive Technicolor within games such as Baldur's Gate. But for other areas, perhaps the odd sourcebook describing a top-level view, perhaps even nothing more than a few paragraphs and statistics. There also doesn't appear to be much in the way of cohesive relationships between the various subsettings. Events mentioned as having an impact on a particular area beyond the focus of a particular book are often not mentioned at all in the sources describing the area being impacted. Some of this is, of course, down to different authors requiring different highlights for the books that they work on, although I will admit that this issue was very much tidied up with the 3rd edition releases for the Realms. In summary, the Western Realms is a vast playground of patchwork subsettings with lore galore if you wish to avail yourself of it, but with a continuing broad front of metaplot that is difficult to keep up with if you wish to stick to canon within your campaign. But, with its kitchen sink approach, the Realms can pretty much be all things to everyone, and all but the most niche concepts of Dungeons & Dragons play can find a home there. If you play Dungeons & Dragons, the answer is simply yes. It is the definitive setting for that game, meshing with its core rules in almost perfect synchronicity, despite certain attempts to disguise that, for example, Sun and Gold Elves being High Elves as far as the core rules go. Within its source materials, you can glean as much or as little detail as you like, depending on the area and nature of the campaign that you wish to run. The current edition of Dungeons & Dragons defaults to the Realms for most of its adventures, and so that also makes for an easy win. The Realms is a high fantasy world, and while I wouldn't call it as academically detailed as, say, Glorantha, it nevertheless has a vast store of maps, locations and characters to draw on that provide the very thing a world designed for use with a game needs to do: save a dungeon master time and effort. Keeping up with the canon, if that is what you wish to do, might cause you a headache, but, in the words of Ed Greenwood himself, there is no right or wrong way to play in the Realms.